Hi, my name is Mark.
Good for you.
So yeah, I guess this is episode 2 of Why You Don't Sound Like Blank. We had our first episode a couple of weeks back on why you don't sound like Guthrie Govan, which wasn't really kind of a first episode. I guess it was more kind of like a pilot kind of a thing. And it did really well actually. So I decided I'd do a second episode. I just decided to change the format a little bit.
Okay, yeah, that's cool.
And as you saw in the title, this video is Why You Don't Sound Like Jazz.
Luscious jazz.
This video is kind of aimed at guitar players, but most instruments can learn a little bit from this. But if you play the guitar, there will be a time when you'll either want to play jazz or perhaps you'll want to play like the jazz players do, which means playing over chord changes and learning all the fancy chords and fancy scales, and that may or may not involve learning actual jazz. And sometimes people don't really like jazz. And that can kind of put them off from learning jazz. In fact, some of my students even say it sounds bad and it's really hard to listen to.
Oh, you are so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
I mean, I can't say I don't understand them, but there's a couple of different ways you can go about this, which we'll get to in a second. So yeah, whether you're trying to get into jazz, or you try to learn some of it and you don't really think it sounds authentic, or it doesn't really sound like the way you want it to sound, I may have a couple of tips for you.
I am interested. We are interested.
Before we get straight into it, I just want to say that timestamps will be in the description below, and while you're down there, please consider subscribing and turning on all the notifications. YouTube's been acting a little bit weird lately. Even if you subscribe to a channel, that channel's videos may really not show up on your subscription box. And even if you ring the notification bell thingy below, you still may not be notified of that channel's content.
Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
So if you want to make sure you're tuned into the content of your favorite creators, and mine, all you have to do is turn on all the notifications. Not just occasional notifications, which are set as the default, you really gotta turn on all the notifications. And also, you may want to consider leaving a like, and perhaps checking some of my other videos after this one. Perhaps you'd like to check out the before mentioned Why You Don't Sound Like Guthrie Govan. Or maybe you'd like to check out, if you're playing guitar and you're not doing this, you're probably playing guitar wrong. Or even maybe 5 advanced chord substitutions and chord progressions that you may want to check out. All of those videos will be on the description below, on the card section right there, and on the annotations of the end screen. So please, stay tuned.
I don't think so, pal.
Okay, so getting to the more juicier stuff, there's just a disclaimer I'm gonna make. Even if you watch this video, you still may not sound like jazz, obviously.
Boo! Not cool!
And maybe the tips I'm going to share with you may be things that you already do, and may not be the things that are stopping you from sounding like jazz. And trust me, all the tips I'm going to share with you today are not the only tips I can share with you on why you don't sound like jazz. But if I was going to make a video sharing all of those tips and all of those reasons, this video is probably going to be like an hour long. So if you end up watching the video and you think, well, I already knew these kind of things and I still don't sound like jazz, or maybe this was really informative or whatever you're thinking, and you'd like some more videos on this, don't forget to leave a comment telling me so.
How about new?
These first 2 tips are much more aimed to stuff that you can practice without really having your guitar. Let's say that you are on the bus, or maybe you're in line for something. Whatever you're trying to do that you can listen to music but not really play along with it, these are going to be things that you can also do in those situations. Not just when you're laying around at home with your guitar, or your chosen instrument.
I like where this is going.
Okay, so I guess my number 1 tip, and this will sound super obvious, but let's be honest, there's a lot of you guys that know about this and still don't do it, so let's get straight into it. Tip number 1 is, you gotta listen to jazz.
Oh, really?
Learning new genres of music is kind of learning different languages. We're all trying to say the same things, we just have different ways to express them. It doesn't matter how many solos you learn, or how many tabs you look up, or how many chords you learn. That doesn't make you a jazz player. Those are just words or sentences that you're learning. It's like if you're trying to learn Japanese, for instance. You may have a Japanese dictionary, and you may learn all of the words and all of the verbs and all of the tenses and whatever, but if you've never heard someone talk in Japanese, you're not really sure on how you're supposed to sound. And you may end up not really sounding right, not really speaking correctly. And it's the same thing with jazz. You really gotta listen to jazz if you want to learn jazz.
He's right. Do you know that?
And getting into tip number 2, after you've listened to a little bit of jazz, you'll find out it's pretty much like metal. You have all these little subgenres, and each one seems to be slightly different, but ends up being super different. And even though you're trying to learn how to play jazz, and you should try and listen to as much jazz as possible, let's say that you figure out that you like, I don't know, that you'll only like bebop jazz or something. You should probably, at least at first, dedicate more time to learning bebop jazz tunes and bebop jazz solos than perhaps learning gypsy jazz. And not just learn what kind of genres do you like, but learning what kind of instruments do you like. If you're watching this video, you're probably a guitar player. And as guitar players really like to listen to other guitar players. Well, at least at first. And if you really want to get that jazz guitar sound, again, at least at first, you should probably listen to jazz guitar players. And once again, not all jazz guitar players play the same way. Some are much more contemporary, while others can be much more modern. And maybe they're even from the same era. So yeah, listen to as much as you can so that you can figure out what you like and what you don't like. And then you can start digging into more of the stuff that you like, so that later on you can learn from the stuff that you don't like. I hope that wasn't confusing at all.
It's too late now!
The next few ones are much more about jazz technique and are much more playing parts, so let's get to the guitar camera.
Now we're talking.
Okay, so as you can see, I grabbed a more proper jazz guitar. This is an Ibanez AG75, I think. And I have my tone knob, well, kind of around 7.5, 8. And even though you don't really need a hollow body guitar or a humbucker loaded guitar, or even having your tone knob rolled off slightly, getting a more appropriate tone to the genre you're trying to mimic can help out a little bit. But sounding like what you want to sound like, it's not really about the gear you use. It's about how much you practice, and how well do you practice.
Oh, you're right. And when you're right, you're right. And you're always right.
Okay, so I guess that when you think of jazz, you're probably thinking about, well, two things really. You're thinking about the comping and the fancy chords. And you probably think about the more outside sounding, more kind of a fancier blues type of souling, like... So I guess I can divide my tips first into the more chordal type of stuff, and then we can get more to the souling stuff.
I don't see the problem.
And just as a little bit of self-promotion here, if you want to learn all the jazz chords and jazz shapes, I have a video about this, and it's actually a pretty funny video, which is about a really bad and kind of meme-worthy pop song that you can quickly learn and learn all the guitar jazz chord shapes. Trust me, all of the minor chords are there, all of the dominant chords are there, all of the regular major chords are there, and even some fancy chords like diminished chords, and even the fancier ones like augmented chords. So yeah, go check out that video and perhaps come back to this one, or maybe check it out after this one. It's your choice. It's in the card section right there, and will be on the annotation section of the end screen. So please, stay tuned.
We'll see about that.
Okay, so you've learned the jazz chord shapes, and supposing you haven't listened to a lot of jazz, or maybe you have but you just haven't practiced it yet, there's a couple of chord progressions you should know. You should know the blues chord progression, maybe just without as much dynamics. A thing you should know is that even though in many genres of music you're told to have dynamics and play more softly in some parts and then play more aggressively in other parts, it's not like that doesn't really happen in jazz. It does. But especially when it comes to the soloing parts, or maybe when you're humping or just playing rhythm for other instruments, you really want to get a sound with few dynamics. I mean, that's even part of the reason why we roll back the tone a little bit. But yeah, that's just probably getting on a tangent. You want to learn that chord progression, which is the blues chord progression. You probably want to learn the minor blues, which is pretty much your regular blues chord progression. But just switch your dominant 7th chords for minor 7th chords, or just minor chords. Or maybe, if you want, you can keep the E7 instead of an E minor 7th. But whichever way you do it, it works. The only thing you gotta be careful is that if you're playing with other people, all the other guys must know what you're doing. And of course, the other chord progression you gotta know is the 2-5-1. And in the jazz community, it has become kind of a meme chord progression. But let's say that you're in C major, for instance. A 2-5-1 is, well, as the name suggests, you play the 2 chord, which in C major would be D minor 7. and you play the 5 chord, which would be G7, and then you go to the 1, the C major 7 chord. Or whichever alteration of these chords you want to do. You may want to do perhaps, I don't know, D half diminished, or D minor 6 actually. And you may want to do, let's say, G major 6, and then C major 6. You would kind of get. But as you could see, those 7th chords are much more jazzier sounding. And this brings us to my next tip, which is jazz sounds really bright. And I don't mean bright as in bridge pickup and going. I mean bright in the more scalar sense. Without really adding much time to this video, because I've talked about this before, as I said in my Guthrie Govan video, there are bright scales and dark scales. But it's not just like, okay, bright and dark. Some scales are red and some scales are blue. There's a whole spectrum in between. And we usually take our major scale as reference. Again, without really getting into too much detail, if you sharpen a note from your major scale, for instance, let's say that you sharpen the 4th, and you get your Lydian scale. Your Lydian scale is just your major scale with a sharpened 4th. So, it's a brighter scale. But let's say that you have your mixed Lydian mode, which is your major scale, but with a flattened 7th. That scale is darker than your major scale. And of course, even more darker than your Lydian scale. And of course, if you take a scale like, I don't know, let's say the Phrygian scale, in relation to your major scale, that Phrygian scale has a lot of flattened notes. It has a flat 9, a flat 3rd or a minor 3rd, has a flat 6th, and a flat 7th. And even if you say, well, but even if that's true or not, I've seen jazz players using the Phrygian scale. And of course you have. It's not like jazz prohibits anyone from using whichever scale or whichever technique they want, but you will see a lot of guys playing, let's say, over a D minor 7th chord, and they will probably use some type of Dorian scale. And another fan favorite is the melodic minor scale, which if you look closely, as a minor scale, it's a pretty bright scale. Again, here's your regular major scale, and here's your melodic minor scale. It's just a note different. It's that flat 3rd that makes it a minor scale. And of course, jazz players use a lot of diminished scales and diminished arpeggios, and diminished is a pretty dark sound. As I mentioned before, jazz players don't just use bright scales and bright sounding stuff, but it is, again, something that's used quite oftenly.
Boring!
So what does that mean to you? Well, that means that, let's say that you have, again, a minor chord, a D minor chord. Let's say that you were thinking about using your Aeolian mode. Again, don't take me wrong, it works really well against that D minor 7th chord, but that isn't really how a jazz player would approach it. He would approach it probably with your Dorian mode, or your Dorian scale. But now, you were probably thinking this. Even though I was using my Dorian mode, I didn't really sound like jazz. Sure, there were some little instances where it sounded kind of jazzier, but it didn't really sound like jazz, right? This brings me to my next tip, which is you really gotta be aware of this 8th note streak. Let's say that you're playing over a 2-5-1, for instance, let's say in C major, like, and it's this tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you were soloing over that 2-5-1, a jazz player would probably solo along these turns. It's not only that you're aware of that 8th note pulse. Let's say that you're thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Some of those beats are more intense than others. That means that your ear is much more focused on beat number 1 and 3 than it is on number 2 and 4. So when you get to your beat number 1 and beat number 3, you'll probably want to land in one of those chord notes. For instance, when you're in D7, in this position your chord tones are D, A, C, and F. So if we go a little slower and we're like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And that takes a little bit of practice. It's not like this is something that's completely autonomous to do. And even when you practice this a little bit, if you want to get more into that bebop style of playing, another thing you can consider doing is when you're doing your 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, of course in beats number 1 and 3, you want to land in one of those chord notes. And let's say that maybe when you're in your beats 2 and 4, you may want to land in a scale tone. Let's say that you're playing over that D minor 7, and you're using your Dorian mode. In beat number 1, for instance, you can land in your D note. In beat number 2, you can land, let's say, in your E note. In beat number 3, you can land in your F note. And in beat number 4, you can land in your G note, for instance. And in those little and notes, like 1 and 2 and 3 and, you can go for more chromatic notes, like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and back to the 1 again. But again, this sort of stuff doesn't really come naturally. It's something that you really need to practice. Even if you want to argue that all the greats like Wes Montgomery and Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and all of those guys, even if you want to argue that they were listening to that in their heads, that just came to them naturally, I can't really speak for them, but I'll say this. Even if they didn't listen to that kind of jazz, they listened to other styles of music that then led to that style of theirs. If you're trying to mimic a genre and you don't listen to that genre, again, getting back to the first tip I shared with you, this sort of lick may sound kind of weird to you, and this kind of mentality may sound kind of weird to you. But let's say that you've listened to blues for years and years and years. This kind of lick, even though it's quite a fancy lick with open strings and color tones and whatever, it doesn't really sound odd to you because you've listened to blues for years. And maybe some of those exotic scales and crazy arpeggios that you find in metal, I'm not saying this is a constant, but let's say for the country guys that don't perhaps use so many of those exotic scales, that may sound kind of fancy or whatever. But if you're a metal guy, you're already used to that kind of sound. Since the video is getting quite long, I'll just share an extra tip with you, which is when you're playing jazz, you really gotta listen to the chord changes. And I'm not just saying listen to the chord changes as in, yeah, you gotta know which chords you're playing over. I'm saying listen to the chord changes as in, you gotta target those chord notes.
Oh, really?
If you're playing over that 2-5-1, you can just play around your G major scale. And it would work, right? But if you're trying to play over that chord progression as a jazz player would, not only do you have to focus on that 8th note streak, but you also gotta make sure that when you're in D minor and you're like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, when you go to that 1, not only do you need to land on a chord tone, because it's the 1, but you can't really land on a chord tone from your D minor 7th chord. You really gotta connect it to your G dominant 7th chord. And an idea would, for instance, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Or something like it. It's like you want to tell a story and you gotta make a bridge between the two chords. And of course, not all jazz players play just with an 8-note pulse. They sometimes play triplets like 1 and 2 and... but that 8th note pulse sounds really jazzy. After all of this, you may think that jazz is really hard to play, and it's really complicated, and it has all of this math that you gotta think about, and all of these crazy chords and whatever. But hey, if you're thinking like that, I just want to say this: you're thinking too much about it. Again, do you think that Charlie Parker, or that John Coltrane, or that Wes Montgomery were playing over chord progressions and they were like, okay, I'm in the end of 2 of a G dominant 7th to a C major 7, so I gotta play a G flat so that I can then move to the G? Do you actually think they were thinking that while they were improvising? They were probably thinking about it during practice, but they weren't thinking of this consciously all the time. It's just something that becomes a habit, right? It's like when you're starting to learn how to play the guitar and you're just a down picker and everything you play it's all in downstrokes. And while you're playing slow, when it comes a time when you gotta play fast and you gotta start doing the alternate picking thing, right? Alternate picking started out by feeling really awkward to do and really hard, and now it's just something that you can probably easily do, right? Well, the same thing with all of these crazy jazz techniques of 8th note pulses and chromatic notes in between. Like, just don't worry, follow the plan. Listen to as much jazz as you can, find out what you like, start practicing slowly, start to transcribe and learn some songs. And of course, if you're just starting out, you probably want to start with something easy like, I don't know, like Autumn Leaves or something. You don't want to go and try to shred over Donna Lee when you haven't even played a simple jazz standard, right? Again, there are tons more that I can share with you, but the video is already quite long. Don't forget to leave it in the comments if you want to see more of this.
I'm pretty tired. Think I'll go home now.
Thank you so very much for watching. I hope I was able to help you out in any way possible. And if I was, please leave it in the comments below. Do you have any suggestions for other videos? Was there something I missed, something I should have said? Do you have anything to add to this discussion? Do you have any other topics or guitar players or genres that you'd like for me to make a video on why you don't sound like them? Or do you have any other suggestions for videos? Please don't forget to leave it in the comment section below.
Please, no more explaining!
As always, I'm giving away free one-on-one Skype lessons.
If it's free, it's for me.
And anyone can enter, but they are limited though, so you gotta be fast. And all you have to do to win one free Skype lesson and discounts on future lessons is to subscribe to my channel, turn on all the notifications, follow me on Instagram, like my Facebook page, and then DM me on one of those social media with screenshots, proving that you did everything mentioned before.
I'll think about it tomorrow.
And yeah, I guess that's it. Again, thank you so very much for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment, like, subscribe, and turning on all the notifications. Maybe check some of my other videos out, and cheers!